I remember exactly when I realised that net zero would not be sufficient to combat human-caused climate change. My world stood still, if only for a moment. I thought of my young daughters, their babies, should they decide to have any, their babies' babies, their babies' babies, their babies. I think you might get the picture. I thought of all of the other things I love in this world, our pristine golden beaches, the native vegetation that lines my home suburb in Canberra, the beautiful eucalypt-lined Brindabella ranges I see from my front porch every single day. Our diverse, extraordinary, but sometimes pretty frightening wildlife. And in this moment, I cried. I cried because I saw the writing on the wall that in order to safeguard ourselves from future climate change, we must also adapt. After many years of climate wars, Australia finally has a legislated date for net zero. By 2050, we must simultaneously emit as little carbon dioxide as we possibly can, whilst also permanently extracting from the atmosphere the tiny amount that we do emit. Now, at the surface, this is an incredibly welcome change in Australia's climate policy, albeit overdue. And this is because the science could not be any clearer about how increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide heats up the planet. But I'm not here today to convince you of the science behind human-caused climate change. That's been done many times over by my peers. But rather, I want to challenge our collective view about what life after net zero will realistically look like. Because while reaching net zero, and not just here in Australia, but globally, is absolutely imperative if we want to ensure that our future generations, our ecosystems, and our planet as a whole thrives, it is now no longer enough. I want that to sink in for a moment. No matter how or when we reach net zero carbon emissions, it will not be sufficient to combat human-caused climate change. That's a really uncomfortable thought, isn't it? And for some of us here today, I'm sure it's a particularly depressing one too. But how do we know this? In order to understand future climates, we rely on physical climate models that are underpinned by supercomputing capabilities. We can do really neat things with them that we can't or shouldn't do in the real world. For example, we can just randomly increase carbon dioxide to 4 times the current amounts in the atmosphere, just to see what would happen. Spoiler alert, it does get really hot. Alternatively, we can reduce the amount of atmospheric carbon to see what the climate would have looked like had the Industrial Revolution not occurred. One recent set of climate model simulations, which were developed by Australia's very own climate model called Access, investigated what the climate would look like post-net zero. 7 different simulations were run, and each of these had a different starting date for when net zero was assumed to occur. And this was 5-year increments from 2030 to 2060. Now, once that date was reached in each respective simulation, no more carbon dioxide was placed into the model's atmosphere. And each of these simulations went for an entire 1,000 years. For climate nerds like myself, this was a really exciting development. Never before had we had model simulations that went this far into the future. It gave us a pioneering opportunity to understand how so many components of our climate system would respond in a post-net zero world well beyond our own expiry dates. Now, I probably don't need to point out our naivety here. Here we are, a bunch of climate nerds, literally champing at the bit to get our hands dirty with data. And it's true, leading up to this moment, we were incredibly naive. But this was more because climate scientists, again like myself, would throw out vague and wafty statements about when things would start to improve post-net zero. 50 years? 100 years? Oh, maybe 200 years, but that's the worst case, I promise. But the data we were now looking at was telling us an incredibly different story. Now, my own research specialty is heat waves, and they have a very strong link to global average temperature. As global average temperature goes up, so too does the frequency, intensity, and duration of heat waves virtually everywhere on the planet. Now, global average temperature is going up because we are putting more carbon into the atmosphere. So at least initially, it isn't a long bow to draw to think that if we stop putting carbon in the atmosphere, average temperatures would decline and heat waves would soon follow. But here's the kicker. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for a really, really, really long time. I am talking multiple centuries here and maybe even longer. On top of that, carbon dioxide emissions have a cumulative effect. So it's not just the emissions in a given year that increase temperatures for that year, but rather the group effort of all of our carbon emissions year on year on year. Now, once we do reach net zero, this pool of carbon dioxide, it will stop growing. However, there will always be more carbon in the atmosphere compared to if the Industrial Revolution never occurred. The end result is more carbon just hanging around in the atmosphere, having a great old time, keeping things extra toasty, which spells bad news for heat waves. Now, for some regions, while heat waves don't necessarily decline like we originally thought they were in a post-net zero world, they don't also necessarily get any worse either. So for these regions specifically, whatever heat waves are doing once we finally reach net zero, they don't do any more or any less, they basically stabilise for the next 1,000 or so years. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case for Australia. Down here in our great southern land, the intensity, frequency, and duration of heat waves continue to increase for at least the next 1,000 years, even if we put no more carbon into the atmosphere. And it was here. This is the moment where my world briefly stopped turning on its axis. Because I saw no matter how or when we reach net zero, our fate, it's already sealed. Now, by no means do I want to give the impression that reaching net zero is futile, not at all. As I mentioned earlier, reaching net zero is absolutely imperative if we are serious about combating human-caused climate change. And timing does matter too. The earlier the better. Reaching net zero just 5 or 10 years earlier could make as much difference as the horrendous heatwave at the beginning of Ministry for the Future, either becoming a dystopian reality or remaining a science fiction. But what I also realised in this pivotal moment was how imperative adaptation is too. If we want to survive and thrive in the future, then we must also adapt. In other words, net zero is our seatbelt and adaptation is the airbag. Now, although it may not seem like it at first, knowing what heat waves and our climate more broadly will do post-net zero is actually really, really valuable. Because it gives us a lead time of decades to put critical bolstering in the form of adaptation in place. Now, adaptation can and should take many different forms. For example, it may be as simple as using a fan-first policy at home, and this is where you reach for your ceiling or pedestal fans well before your air conditioning remotes. It could also look like far more stringent building practices Australia-wide, so that all of us finally no longer have to live in glorified tents. A larger focus on urban greening strategies would also help as well. This could look like encouraging more residents to plant trees on their properties to keep them cooler when heat waves occur. Targeted and widespread outdoor workplace policies would also go a very long way. Believe me, sustained periods of extreme heat are deadly, and expecting those that have outdoor occupations to work long hours in the blistering conditions, that definitely needs thoughtful review. And our public healthcare infrastructure could also do with some love. COVID highlighted some pretty big gaps in our healthcare system, which will only turn into gaping chasms if we do not address them swiftly and permanently. Sure, these measures won't stop or even reduce the causes behind climate change, but they will go an incredibly long way in diminishing the impacts of the future heatwaves that are surely coming for us in a net zero world. This will improve our quality of life, our health, our happiness vastly. It will even save us money. Every dollar that we invest now in critical adaptation saves many times that amount in the avoided costs of future disasters. In some cases, this saving is up to tenfold the original investment. And you know what? We have the knowledge to develop and roll out these adaptation strategies, as well as now finally knowing what we need to adapt to in a post-net zero world. Without this knowledge, some of us may survive, but assuredly none of us will thrive. Because net zero will keep us firmly strapped into our seats, but it will ultimately be adaptation that softens the blow. You see, net zero and adaptation, they are not mutually exclusive. Together, they are so much more powerful than the sum of their parts. And this is something we all must keep front and centre of our minds as we collectively move through a warmer world. Because the future isn't something that happens to us, it is something that we prepare for.